Welcome to today's Survivor Circle. I'm Becky Perkins, Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project, and so happy to welcome two of my absolute favorite people on the planet, Melanie Sachs-Barton and Jamie Rosselin, for an amazing conversation about the power of community. And it seems like this is more important than ever that we have this conversation. So very happy to welcome you both again and looking forward to this conversation. And I will turn it over to you, Jamie, to get us started. Welcome.
Thanks, Becky. So good to see you. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whenever you're tuning in from, whatever time that is for you. I'm really excited to be here with my friend and colleague, Melanie. And today we're just going to talk a little bit about community. Um, and how community and like survivorship kind of go like hand in hand. And so I think Zero Abuse Project and SurvivorSpace as a whole has been really great about developing community for survivors. I know in my personal life, I have been very blessed by having like in-person community, but also having like virtual and kind of like long distance community is also really helpful. Um, and so I think where we can get started in this conversation, Melanie, if that sounds good for you, is just to kind of talk about um, how victimization doesn't happen like in a silo. I think it's real easy for people to imagine there's like perpetrators or like quote unquote bad guys who are like out there acting independently and maliciously towards people. And there's no weight of the community to like take on any of that responsibility. So I know for me that my victimization happened in the context of community. And when I say that, it means there were a lot of people who were um, willfully like turning a blind eye or like believing myths and misconceptions about what was happening to me, or even profiting off my victimization. Um, I was publicly shamed for what was going on. I was criminalized for what was happening to me. So a lot of the harm that came from my victimization didn't just happen because of like a perpetrator. Um, and then if you take it to the context of like surviving trafficking, there was also, a whole slew of like buyers who, contributed to the demand for my victimization. Um, but then all these people who were directly and indirectly involved who were just like turning a blind eye. So a lot of the harm that happens um, when it comes to abuse happens in the context of community. And so I definitely know that that was my experience. Melanie, I'd love to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this. I mean, the beautiful thing is our stories are so vastly different in the context of our victimization, the type of victimization, the time frame of victimization. And my experience with community within my victimization is very different. I Mine was kind of, I will say, like lightly, a little bit siloed, but the ripple effect that happened after is very similar. The public shaming, the experiences with peers. I had a friend, I'm using quote, a friend, so I was victimized very young. I was 9 years old and then 12 years old. And, so I was in school, middle school, which is brutal to begin with, right? With friendships and figuring out who you are and all of that. But I had this big looming mountain over my head of a trial and a court case, and I felt vastly different from my peers with the pain that I was carrying. And so, I didn't really have any necessarily like boundaries or knowing who to trust or all of that. I was just talking to my friends about it because that's what you do when you're in seventh grade and eighth grade. You tell your friends everything. And so I had this kind of group of friends, I'll say, that I had just been talking in class, like I'm having a hard time concentrate. I don't remember the exact conversation, but having a hard time concentrating, and this is why. I have this big thing going on, and like they knew bits and pieces of it, but this one day I was talking about the actual victimization, like in a little bit of detail. And this friend said to me, well, if you talk about it so much, you must have liked it. And so like that started my this ripple effect of my community, instead of being supportive, falling away from me. Um, and I had already felt like I lost so much. My whole life was consumed with this trial and waiting and court dates, then court dates being canceled, and preparing to testify, and then being told that there wasn't anything happening. And so there was a lot of pain. I was battling like self-injury, and there was some talk about that was for attention, that I was doing that for attention. And so there was just like this, although my abuse itself didn't happen in community, the ripple effect of the impact of community, that I was leaning on, that I was trusting with my story, with my experience, it was met with judgment, shaming, blaming, not believing, re-victimizing, honestly, and but there's another side to that too. In another way, I had incredible people put on my path that did the opposite, right? We're talking here about community that can both hurt, and then community that can heal. And so I had kind of both of those, again, very different from your experience, but I think there's some common threads that we can talk about as we move through this. But we both thought about this topic of like, survivors needing that community, like that soft place to land. And again, I'll do another shout out. SurvivorSpace and Zero Abuse Project have done an incredible thing. Especially, I mean, I'll talk briefly about our friendship, how our friendship started. We started as kind of colleagues. We were tasked with like doing some of the social media in the very beginning of SurvivorSpace. And then we started to do some circles with some of the other subject matter experts that were hired just like us. And but then from that, like it became a beautiful friendship beyond what we're doing here. Like we're talking about getting together one of these days and doing some presentations at other conferences together. And so it's like when you have that soft place to land, it can grow into something so incredibly beautiful beyond your victimization and beyond your professional role. And so SurvivorSpace has done an amazing job at like bringing adult survivors together, with that solidarity of that soft place to land in community. So
Yeah. I think too, like when I think about how like my victimization happened in the context of community, I do like for me, it feels all like enmeshed together, like the actual victimization and then like the fallout, right? Like it doesn't feel like two separate events. It feels very much like um this singular thing that happened over the course of like years. And so I definitely can relate to not just feeling like community what was harming me during my victimization, but then like community continued to harm me like beyond my victimization. And in many ways made it difficult to get like past like from that space of being like a victim to that place of like being a survivor. But I think like you, like where there was so much harm being created, there was also like community that was around that really wanted to embrace me, to like help me heal, to like support me. Um, and yeah, so it's been, years and years since my victimization. And I think it's just interesting how community has like, um, there's always been a thread of community that's like, been at the core of like me moving forward, but like how that's like evolved over the years, like the different communities that I've been a part of, and what they've meant to me. And as I've grown and evolved, like how that's like shifted. Um, and I'm just curious too, like, and thinking for myself, like, how do you differentiate between like community that's there to harm and like community that's there to heal? Um, Especially for like survivors whose like trust has been so um chiseled away at. And I don't know if I have like an exact answer, but it's just something that came to me because like community's been such a big part of my healing. but community's also been a big part of what's like harmed me. So like, how do you tell the difference? And Melanie, I don't know if you have any answers, and we didn't even discuss this
I
question
know, yeah.
ahead of
No,
time.
that's a great question. I mean, that's a great question to ponder for everybody, tuning into this now or later is like, how do you take care of yourself enough or know yourself enough to know what's healing versus what's harmful? And how do you say goodbye to what's harmful and say hello to what's healing, And that's a level of trust, because a lot of survivors I know for me for a while is like, I just isolated because I was like, you know what? That response from my friends was so hurtful that I'm just not going to tell anybody about it and I'm going to let the pain like just eat me up inside really because that's more worth it than trying to tell someone about the aftermath. But I think I came to a point where and again, I don't know that this is an answer to that question, but I came to a point where I started to see what it looked like. So there were modeled examples of safe community. And so I started to really turn my face towards those and learn from those of like, okay, that's what that looks like. And it's like anything, like the healing journey. Some things serve you well in one season, other things will serve you differently in another season. And you might go back to some types of community and you might change, you're talking about that evolving. And something that you had brought up when we were talking about this before is like community kind of starts as the villain, right? If your victimization has that level of community involved, but through the resilience and goodness of people and soft places to land, you start to shift that perspective of yes, like community started as the villain, but it doesn't have to continue as it. So there's this level of resilience within ourselves as survivors that we develop as we start to, hear and feel and see that community in soft places to land. And so my challenge for people who might have an opportunity to be that place, um, to learn from two survivors here saying, this is how you can be that soft place to land. And some of those things are listening, less talking, and, being compassionate, believing survivors when they tell you their experience, not blaming them for how they're reacting or what they're doing or what they're, all of the above. And I'm sure there's many other tidbits that we could unpack. But, for me, it was really when I started to see it, really clinging to it and seeing what it could do for me, being open handed with what good, safe community could do for me rather than going back to those brick walls that I was hitting with certain people and expecting them to change. I think I had to move on from some of the friendships and some of the people that just weren't going to be able to understand what I was going through and or be able to handle it and or were just like toxic and not that soft place, kind of the opposite. And so, like, being able to build yourself up in resilience enough to know what you deserve in community. And maybe even I talked on the last circle I did, this was more about like healthy relationships, but it's all intertwined. But making like a non negotiable list of like, these are things that I'm not going to settle for in my community. Like this is how not I'm not going to allow these someone to talk to me this way or blame me this way for my victimization, or I'm not going to be part of this in this season. Sometimes writing it down of what you're not going to settle for is helpful. I mean, for me, it like journaling or, even if it's just like a sheet of paper that you put in your back pocket or just, type it out on your phone or something that like once you come to what your safe community looks like, write those things down too of like what do I want, so the non-negotiables of what I'm not going to settle for, but also what do I want in community as you discover it, and it'll evolve and change, and writing those changes down too of when the narrative changes. So just something tangible to throw out there.
Yeah, I really like connect with and relate to that idea of um like, oh, like communities harm me. It's been like a villain in my story, but like how do I find community that's gonna like be healing? How's it got like where's the community that's gonna be that like soft place to land, like to use your
Zero.
words?
Yeah.
And I do think part of it was like seeing it modeled, and some of it was like seeing it modeled kind of in more like professional or like formal relationships, like in the beginning, um, like with therapists and things like that, and then kind of figuring it out like in those relationships and like how do I you know, find community that like reflects those like values outside of those like professional relationships. Because I think professional relationships is like a great place to start. Um, but like communities is more than just like the professionals around you. And it's more than just the mentors around you, but it's like also like friends and like colleagues and um, all sorts of like actors, like right in the community. And you t talked a little bit about like victim blaming, and I think about the story of your like friend, and those words that she said. And there's like this video that I often play at trainings about victim blaming, and it kind of goes into this idea of like the just world hypothesis. Um, and it's this idea that like the psychology around why people victim blame is because they don't want to believe that there's like bad things that can happen to you in the world, either randomly or systemically. They want to believe that like if they just like avoid certain behaviors or do things the right way, that they can be removed, right? Or they can escape, any type of victimization. And I think it's a good video that kind of, humanizes. I think it's really easy to like villainize people who say things like that. And like for sure, like those words should never have been said to you. But it's like this was also just a young girl who didn't want to believe something like that could happen to her. And so
Yep.
to create distance between you and her, blames
Hmm.
you so she could feel
Hmm.
safe, right?
Yep.
And I think it's real easy to have empathy for other teenage girls.
Yep.
Than it is, but like, you know, um, this is things that like, parents do when they have kids who
Hmm.
are victimized. This is things that communities do when they have, and usually victim blaming, it, like, becomes more exacerbated when like that person is like, I guess this isn't the words I would love to use, but like becomes difficult to help, right? Like the more difficult it is to help them, the more people tend to distance themselves and say, this is their fault. They've done this to themselves. Um, and so I think some of like the key components when I'm like looking for a healthy community, even if I'm like looking for a new therapist or like just where do I fit in, is kind of figuring out where their values are. Like, are these people who don't victim blame? Like, is there a sense of like non-judgment, like being non-judgmental? It kind of goes back to like trauma-informed principles, right? Like, are they going to be culturally responsive with me? Are they going to be um, transparent and trustworthy? Um, and is there a level of like manipulation that's going on? Because I don't want anything to do with anything that feels manipulative or coercive. Can I just come to this space and be myself? And I think, you know, as I was like going through my healing journey, I found myself in different communities that were good. Um, and that had a lot of benefit for me. But I hadn't quite like found like my people, my group of people. And I remember um this was so many years ago, and they do this program so differently, but Elevate Academy with the Rebecca Bender initiative, I got put into this cohort with a few other survivors. One of them who's a subject matter expert for SurvivorSpace as well. And, we just met on Zoom on a weekly basis. And um, I had never really spent time with other survivors like that. And I was like, oh, these are my people. Like these are so, so my people. And so, out of that group, three of us are still super close. We don't, we live in all different parts of the country, But we've really been there for each other through difficult things. And these were relationships that started online, but then, became like real friendships that, I hope to see last a lifetime. Um, and so I've been really lucky to have these like virtual connections that turned into um, in-person connections as well. Um, and so I don't think that's necessarily like my journey with it of like going through these different communities and being like, well, this is good, but it's not quite the right fit. And this is good, but it's not quite the right fit. And then finding the survivor community and that being like, oh, this feels like the right fit. I don't want to be prescriptive towards,
Yeah.
Hmm.
anybody else. Survivors might not, you know, the survivor community or parts of the survivor community might not be your like cup of tea.
Mhm.
And I have so many great relationships with allies, and advocates as well. But for me, that's where um, I feel like truly seen and heard. And it's a space where like I don't have to share my story. I mean, and that's a big, for me, like the boundaries and non-negotiables for
Mhm.
me, it's like, oh, I don't really share my story with people. And I don't do that in the survivor community, but there's this unspoken like truth of the experience, that I can't, it's hard to even put it into words. It's hard to put into words, but I'm like, you're not just practicing non-judgment here, but like there really isn't judgment here because
Living it. Hmm.
yeah.
Living it out. Yeah, and I've had some similar experiences too. But I have two that are interesting that you mentioned, like Rebecca Bender's programming and things like that. I ended up doing, I'll talk about this one first just because it's a good segue, but I ended up doing a like book, like there was a book that was released, and Rebecca actually was like, hey, who wants to do this book club with me? And so I actually jumped on, and this was not like a survivor specific, like this was just like women meeting together. It didn't have anything to do with like certain type of survivorship or anything. And it was over COVID, so it was like a time where like there was so much going virtual, and I'm a very social gal, and so I was really struggling. And I didn't necessarily need like what I'll talk about next. Like that's I relate with like the survivor community being my people. But this was just like a gathering of ladies together, that was so, so amazing. And actually one of the women in that cohort group is a subject matter expert with Zero Reviews Project. So we got to reconnect here too. But it was just like this, like, hey, we're reading this book, we're gathering, we're like hanging out during COVID virtually. And again, it had nothing to do with like, I talked about all aspects of my life, not just my survivorship. I mean, it came up, but it was so cool to be, because I had previously virtually only been in survivor communities, virtually, which is my people and where I feel most seen. But this was like another type of community. So I think there is voice to that of like, it doesn't have to be focused on your survivorship. It can actually be like, who you are as a person, and you want to read this book too, and like gathering together for like book club. I've heard about really cool things coming out of like book clubs, or like gathering to play whatever game you like to play, or like there's just such value in these different types of communities, in addition to survivor communities, if that's something that is your cup of tea, like Jamie and I. But this was such a lifeline for me when like my work was going remote, and it was really chaotic and hard, um, versus work from home and like then be deployed back to the office and then be back at home, and just a lot of back and forth. But then just to know that I had this like community that I could just like be myself and not have to like do anything. It was just so like life-giving. It definitely kept me going during that time, because there was all different opinions around me of like people who didn't want to hang out because of COVID, and people who like, and that was hard for me because I was like, I don't know where everybody stands. And like, it was nice to have like a community of like friendships that were building. So it was something to focus on when like a lot of my friendships were kind of not on hold, but like we couldn't see each other in person, or people didn't want to. And so I had felt like I had this like community of friendships that again wasn't focused on like my victimization or really my work. It was just like, hey, just show up, and like we're reading this book, and let's like talk about life. And like the author of the book actually ended up jumping on and like surprising us one of the meetings. And so yeah, it was just like a cool, like a sidestep to the community I had already found in, and I'll talk briefly about a survivor community I was part of, Unleash. It's a course for survivors from Nicole Braddock Bromley, who's a survivor as well. Um, in the space, and you know, I have found I've actually had my last circle I had one of the girls that was in my cohort for that group. We did a survivor circle and was able to bring her into this community. So I feel like there's a lot of like intertwining communities, and just like, hey, like I met you at that other thing, but here we are, and hey, I'd love to bring you on and, you know, have you do this with me, and like helping other survivors have a platform for their voice if they wanted. And so it's just been a really sweet thing to find. And for me, it's really come back to SurvivorSpace in a lot of ways, which is really cool. And then having those friendships that, like you talked about, from these little cohorts that we've been part of, that go beyond that. Like I've seen some of the subject matter experts from here in person, like at the airport a couple, like last month. And you know, we try to meet up if we can, if we're in the same city for something, or you know, I'm going to be in Florida. You know, there's like different connections that you know, we think of each other when we're like, hey, I'm going to be in your like area, let's meet up, or you know, because we long for that connection in person too. And so being able to start virtually and then meet in person is a really sweet thing. So yeah, just a little bit about
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, like thinking through like what it means to be in like survivor community. Um, and I think there are like certain like projects or like times or like cohorts where things feel really like centered on like survivorship, and like overcoming and like resilience. Um, but then I feel like I've also gotten the pleasure of just being in survivor community where like that isn't the focus. It's more just about like doing life together. I know like Melanie, when you and I talk, a lot of it is talking about like our kids and our lives, and you know, we'll touch on whatever we need to touch on, but so much of it is just about the whole person as opposed to um you know, that shared experience. It's, I feel like for me, there's like a time and place for like hashing through that shared experience with like one another. Um, but then there's like other times where like that shared experience is like what brought like what initially brought people together, but then like it buds and grows. I'm really lucky. In Jacksonville, we have a community called Arise Together. And it is like an in-person community of, um, I don't remember exactly, but around like 50 survivors. And like we get together like once a month. And, um, you know, there's, sometimes like we're focused on like healing and goal setting and like stuff that has to do with survivorship. And other times we're just getting together and, you know, sharing life with one another. So I think too, like when trying to figure out what community looks like for you, like as an individual, not Melanie, but audience,
in
you,
general. Yeah.
um, it's it's about like determining what's right for you at the right time. I think if I was only part of survivor community that like focused on like victimization and survivorship, and that was like the sole focus, I don't think that would necessarily be healthy for me. Um, Not that there's not periods of time where like
Mhm.
I need to dig into that stuff. Um, but so much of my life isn't just about what I survived. It's about like who I am today, like what I was able to create with my life from that. Like,
Mhm.
and in spite of that. So I think that's also, you know, interesting. I think the other thing too is like the connections that like you make once you like get into communities like this. Um, and it is this like this social capital that like is so, so important. Um, where like it's about like sharing opportunities and experience and like mentorship. Um, and I know like in some ways, like I did all of my school online, right? So like I could only build so much social capital like
Yeah.
in the classrooms because I'm just interacting with people, you know, um, behind screens, and a lot of times it's not even like on Zoom calls. I think like the best connections I have was like the social science cohort that I was in. It's because we met by Zoom like on a weekly basis, and then we had some like in-person like touch points,
Mm.
throughout the course of time. But yeah, like when you have like pieces of your life kind of taken away from you, like by victimization, and you're not getting to build that social capital that people usually are being able to build, like that's when I think community gets really important, where like you build that community with survivors, with like allies, with people who care about you, who open up those like professional and like personal opportunities. Um, and you just don't get that without community.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can definitely relate. Um, I think for the first 10 years after my victimization, it was very much like I needed that survivor community digging into all the things and like going deep and like really unpacking the layers of the onion of what had happened, the aftermath of what had happened, the damage done, all of the above. But then this like so it's been 20 years for me around since my victimization, and so this kind of second 10 years. So the first 10 years was all of that. Um, Pretty much the second 10 years has really been like me really stepping out of that like survivor role and like I mean, yes, I still like have spaces where I identify as that and I share my story pretty openly and publicly, both in small spaces like this and across the country. But I now I kind of open my speeches with like I'm a survivor more than my story, as a reminder to the people listening, but also as a reminder to myself of like um a lot of this was born out of like who I am now, like was born out of my survivorship, but it isn't all there is to it. And so I really try to focus, and I often like will say like I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a volunteer, I'm a coffee lover, I'm a Camp Sunshine volunteer. I try to identify every time I speak now with like who am I outside of that, like again both as a reminder to myself and a reminder to those listening of like hey, like don't get stuck on the story, and I'm not really going to share a ton of the details. I really want you to hear like what happened as a ripple effect from that. Like I might not have gone back to dance if I didn't find healing in community, because that was one thing that was ripped away from me because of my victimization. And I might not have done this or this, and or had the confidence to try this, or and so I really for this second decade of kind of my healing over, like, we know it's not linear and it doesn't end, but my journey has really been focusing on who am I beyond my story, and how can I share that with the world, and how can I get in spaces that encompass that of like just doing life together. Like, yes, there's this unsaid solidarity sometimes when there's like a bunch of survivors in a room, but it's like really like I love coffee, so let's go like talk about that for 3 hours. We were just talking about that this morning, Becky and I, before you jumped on, of like we just talked about coffee for like 5 minutes. But it's just and it's those little things that are the big things. And something I loved from one of the Unleash 8 week kind of course, like we definitely dig into a lot of stuff. There's like 8 survivors in each cohort. We get into the nitty gritty, we get into the really hard stuff, but there's like kind of challenges at the end of each workbook session where it's like something that's like outside of your survivorship. So like do something that you love to do as a child and report back next week. And so like I did for one of mine was like go do cartwheels on the beach and then like tell people how that was for you. And again, that was like something silly and like something that didn't carry a lot of weight to it. But it was so healing to be able to share, like, it just brought me back to like that carefree childhood before my victimization. And it was actually really fun to do as an adult, to know I still got it. But just like looking outside of the box, especially if you've been in that like survivor label box for so long, which like serves a purpose for you for a season. It can, and it will. But looking kind of outside of that, of like, what do you enjoy outside of that? Who can you get connected with for activities outside of that? And it's even more healing when you're doing it with other survivors, right? Like you're all just hanging out and doing life together, or walking the beach together, or I always go back to the ocean, but whatever some people hate the ocean, so whatever your thing is, climbing mountains or running races or like fundraising for a cause or like whatever your thing, or just sitting in a room and like coloring together and not talking about anything, so what are those types of things? And I think about that often of like, from this kind of 10-year framework of getting out of that like survivor label and those spaces where it's all heavy all the time. And I've even changed like some of the things that I watch or some of the things that I like tap out of content more than I used to. Like when I would go to conferences, I used to go to all those case studies and all the things, but now I like don't. I go to the spa instead. Especially if I'm speaking at a conference, like I really try not to sit in and take anything in. And so like never thought I would say that, right? Because I worked in the field, I'm a survivor. Like I thought I'd be all in all the time, but it's actually been really healthy for me to step out of those spaces and just like chill and just like go for a walk or do something different in the area that I'm in, like a touristy thing or whatever. And that's like something that I never thought I would see, but it shifted in the second half of the 10 years of like what it looks like. And that's okay. Like, and I think that can be actually really empowering to say, like, I don't have to do it the way I've always done it. I can switch it up. And that's very much what the healing journey is too. And so we definitely encourage that kind of out of the box thinking when it comes to what your community looks like at each season of your survivorship.
Yeah, I think for me, like currently, like healthy community looks like, people encouraging me to like figure out like what do I like enjoy now? Like what can I like reclaim in my life? So I like love photography. And it's like the community I have now like encourages me to like um, explore that side of myself. And like I never want to get to this place where I'm being like too prescriptive for
Yeah.
people, right?
Yeah.
Like, but I don't, why I think like it has been healthy for me to like really dig into like survivorship. Like I don't think that's what like healthy community would look like for me like today. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say I'm really impressed that you can still do cartwheels. I can't. Um, so that's just
I wasn't
impressive.
entirely sure, so I had to
Yeah.
roll the dice on that one.
Yeah. I think it's been years since I tried, but the last time I tried, it was not successful. So just want to say kudos for that. Um, but yeah, I think it's good too when you can like find these new areas of like interest and then you get to like expand your community to like people who have those shared interests too. Um, and I think it can be interesting like um navigating between like this really like trauma informed, holistic, like survivor centered like community where like they know your story and like there's unspoken things that don't need to be said and then kind of transitioning into these like other places where like people don't know you're a survivor, they don't know your background, and you're connecting with people on these like different levels like of these different interests. Um, and I think that's like, something for people to explore too. And like, how do you find healthy and safe communities then, right? Because now you're kind of stepping out of this like trauma-informed kind of world. Um, so I just think that's like also an interesting part of like the evolution of like, we do, I know at least for me, I've like curated these really safe spaces for myself, but what does it look like to venture outside of those safe spaces? Like, and what happens like when I don't want to identify as a survivor or like
Mhm.
I get identified as a survivor when I don't intend to be or
Yeah.
once again just like curious and I've navigated some of those spaces, but I think so much of my journey has been about like curating these safe spaces. What does it look like to find community outside of
Yeah.
those
I
little
think sometimes the
nooks?
most healing has been for me, especially in recent years, has been things that have nothing to do with my, like nothing at all, like not even like a glimpse of it, of like just like even like in my adult tap and jazz dance class, like some people know, like just from like following me on social media or whatever it is. But like some people in the class have no idea, and we just dance together every Tuesday, right? And we're in a recital together and we call ourselves a dance team. And, and it's like I can just be Melanie without all the other things. And it can they focus on talking to me about my daughter and my husband and my family and things that I built outside of my survivorship. And so sometimes those are the most healing conversations these days, or like that I can just be myself without all of that, because I've carried that along with me for so long in so many different spaces, that like being able to separate from that, not in a level of like avoidance or like it's not part of me, but in the level of like this is not all that I am. And like I fought so hard to get to a place where this is not all that I am. And so really leaning into and like having friendships or people that don't know or don't talk about it or don't, aren't asking about it, or, whatever it is, being able to just sit in those spaces, where people just don't, we just don't go there, and we just like do whatever the activity we're doing is. And that's been some of the most healing times for me in these recent seasons.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. I just checked on like the participant list, and I see we have a very special participant
We do.
um,
I was
with
trying
us.
to be low key about it, but I think it's
Yeah,
time.
yeah. I'm wondering if she wants to pop any questions or their chats in the chat, or if she has any comments or anything. And she might just be low key hanging out and no
Mhm.
pressure either. So.
Yeah. Yeah. um while we're waiting for that, I was looking at, we were looking at some concepts about like community, like research and things that communities can give back to us. And I think, there was a article that I had pulled up that talked about community in the context of like what that can look like, gave some examples. Again, not all of it would apply to everyone or anyone, right? But it talked about how, like, oftentimes when we're victimized, like, community is taken away from us, and like when it's restored back, and oftentimes, like, there's a cultural pressure of like um, autonomy and independence. And so we're like, I can handle this on my own. I don't need community, or community won't serve me, or community has already hurt me. So why invest in it, right? And so there's this pressure to like handle it on our own, especially something so personal and so, um, difficult to navigate. But then, looking at, you know, research that talks about that connection to others leads to positive outcomes for trauma survivors. And so it's just a little tidbit of like, there is research to back up what we're talking about. We're talking about very personal experiences, or again, not trying to be prescriptive, but talking about our individual experiences, talking about the vast varieties of community that's out there. But there is actually something to back it up, that when community is restored back to you, especially if you're a survivor, it really has great results in healing and in, moving forward in life. And there's a lot of threads there. So just wanted to kind of like talk about like in general that concept of like, restoring back community and what that can do, because when victimization happens, we feel isolated from our community, or it's taken away, or what we thought was our community is no longer our community. So even just some of those concepts, wanted to kind of bring it back to like, it's not just like us here talking about it, that it's like a thing that we both found and we love it, and on the surface, but like it really is like a deep, like, for those out there who love the science piece of things, there is something to back us up here, and different concepts that actually prove that it is valuable on your journey, whatever it looks like. Again, insert your type of community that's helpful wherever you're at. But yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, America is a very like individualistic like society. Um, but I think there really is something to be said for like interdependence and like leaning on one another and like relying on other people like for support. Um, but like, we're really like touting community now. And like I think we've talked about some of like the shortcomings of community like in our past as well. Um, but building community can be like difficult. I was reading something the other day and it was something along the lines of like when you're in resilience, you don't feel resilient. Like when you're going through being resilient, that doesn't feel resilient. It feels awful. It's hard. It's like challenging. And so I think this idea, like if community is not something that's like coming to you easily, I think I would just say that that's like normal. Like if you're not finding the community that feels like 100% the right fit, like I think that's like normal too. Like it takes time and it like takes work and it takes like that resilience. And we could talk a lot about how important resilience is, especially to survivorship. But I think one thing we don't talk about enough is like the experience of going through resilience isn't always like pleasant. And there's going to be conflict in the community, right? And I think that's where like a lot of healing and growth can come from. Like when you're part of a like healthy, good community, then you um, get to see ways of like conflict resolution like handled. Um, and like maybe that's something you didn't learn growing up. Like maybe that's not that was something that was taken away from you during victimization, right? But these are like skills to be like developed.
Yeah.
And you know, um, there's always going to be families, there's always going to be neighborhoods, there's always going to be jobs, and like being able to like navigate conflict and do it well and do it with grace is, a skill that I've definitely learned from being in community.
Yeah.
It hasn't just been through being in like therapy. It's been through seeing those like things modeled, um, learning from others, having other people show me like grace. Because I think that's like one of the most challenging things about being in community is when there's like conflict and like
Hmm.
when it arises, like how do you handle that? Um, and I know for me, a lot of times it's like, well, I'm just going to shut down and not be a part of this community anymore, um, which that's not helpful because you spend so much time like investing and building into these relationships, and then if like one small things go wrong, then you're like out, then you just have to rebuild all over again. It's actually like easier to just address the conflict. And I'm not saying I think there are times where like leaving community might be the right choice also. Um, but
Yeah.
so there's
Well,
just
yeah.
thoughts.
It's hard. We're all people, right? And especially when there's like a lot going on in each individual life that is part of the community, it's hard. And there's definitely times to walk away and some times to stick it out and work it out. But also, thinking about for me, like in community, especially in like professional community that I found myself in, it was a lot of like finding my voice and confidence again, of being like, I have a seat at the table, like I can take the microphone. And like, this was before I started speaking publicly, I have a microphone in my hand often now. But then also like knowing when to also just like hand the microphone off. Because I think once I found my voice, like I couldn't stop being like, even like group projects, like I'd be the one that would always volunteer to like write, record, and then present it, right? Because I was just like, I found my voice was silenced and then I found it again and now I can't like not have it. But then there was a time where, especially like, in my career where it was like I was part of this like leadership cohort, again, had nothing to do with like my story or my victimization. It was really in a professional setting of like just like a bunch of professionals in my community getting together once a month and like learning about different jobs and different places in our community. And we had to do all these like leadership based like exercises. And one of them was write a 2 minute or speak like write a 2 minute speech and deliver it, like it was like the public speaking skill that we had to like, and so I wrote it about like the title of mine was Microphones Don't Scare Me. But I actually talked about kind of the opposite of that, almost, of like handing the microphone off to someone else and sitting under someone else's feet and listening. Because I can do it. I can be the recorder, I can write it, I can speak it, I can present it. It doesn't scare me to present a group project. But like, what if someone in the group is like, especially in a leadership development, like wanting to have the chance to do something that comes very easy to me that might be a challenge for them, but they're in this circle wanting to have the opportunity because this might be the only shot they get to be the recorder and to hold the microphone. And like, if I just like went up there because it's easy for me to do, and oftentimes in group settings, people would look to me to do that. I just like, now in group settings, I give it a minute to see if there's anybody else who wants to take that responsibility, to give someone else the floor, to give someone else the microphone, because that could be something that they're trying to grow in. And if I just automatically do it, like that's not going to help them grow either. So, that was definitely something that I never thought about really, of like, being in community and like helping others grow by me just like sitting back and being a wallflower, which is not my strength. So it's, but it grew me in ways to just sit and be quiet, right? So, I mean, not in like a shameful way of like, you don't say anything, but like in a growth way of like, maybe I could learn from the person that's taking the microphone next. Um, and so just being able to kind of grow in that way, within community of like doing something out of my comfort zone, um, and giving opportunity for others to do something outside of their comfort zone as well.
Yeah. I think that brings up for me too, like one thing that I really value about community that hasn't been said is like this place where I also get to be the mentor. Like I get to take like my lived experience and the skills that I've learned over years and like all that resiliency and all of that. And that gets to be something that I like give back to community. And I think you and I've talked a lot about like receiving from community, but like a big part of community is investing and like giving back to that community as well. And I think there's lots of different ways to do that and like different like passions to follow like in that. But that's been like a key component is not just having like mentors and like people who can pour into me and having like peers and like people who I can do life with, but then also having people who like I'm mentoring and like who I'm learning from like as they're coming up, like it's their like healing and growing. And so I think that's like another beautiful component of component like community is like at some point like we talked about all the different kind of like actors like in
Yeah.
community, but it's like in community, you'll also wear like a lot of different hats.
Mhm.
And those hats might like change and evolve based on like your needs and like your capacity and like where you're at in life. Um,
Mhm.
so I love that too. I love that community is also like an outlet for me to like give back, to like mentor others, to encourage others, and to learn from
Mhm.
like these newer voices and give them opportunities to, work on skills that like, oh yeah, I mean, I think January was, Human Trafficking Awareness Month. I did a ton of speaking, and I remember someone coming up to me at one of the events. It's like, you seemed really relaxed up there. I'm like, yeah, I don't know how many times I've done this month, but it's been a lot. So yeah, I'm
Mhm.
relaxed. This is
Yeah. Yeah.
par for the course, but like it can be really challenging for other people. So like, how do you like help others. It was actually interesting, like at that speaking engagement, I wasn't even supposed to be the speaker. There was like someone I was like supporting who was
Yeah.
going to be the speaker, and then she got sick last minute. And I was like, it's cool, I'll go and do
Yeah.
it instead. Um,
Hmm.
so it's just yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting how things grow and evolve and how yeah, at some point
Yeah.
you're the person getting help and then you become the helper. So
Yeah, and it goes beyond your story, right? The last couple circles I did, I really wanted to kind of turn down the volume on me and elevate the other survivors that came on here and shared some of their experiences. I mean, I helped with framing the conversation because I've done these circles a million times, right? But really being able to, they're in college and they're just starting to speak publicly and like really enjoying these opportunities to have their voices be heard. And I'm sitting back there like watching them speak and I'm like so proud of them and like beaming and I'm not saying a word and I'm just like, because I remember myself when my first couple opportunities to speak in like a public forum came up, like I remember that feeling of like, wow, like this is really powerful. This is really healing for me. This is really empowering. And so to be able to give that gift to someone else, and like years ago, I never would have pictured myself doing that, right? When I was receiving it. And then just to see like how it all comes like full circle that you can just like spur others on with the courage that you've had to have a similar courage to, do the hard thing, do the thing for the first time, or try something new. So,
well, Melanie, I think this has been a really, really great conversation, and it's such a privilege to be able to, um, yeah, just come on here for an hour and chat with you
yeah,
and kind of dig into these, you know, ideas and beliefs and share them
yeah,
with others. So I really thank you for your time and thank you for your friendship and your
yeah.
colleagueship.
Right. All the things that it's turned into, right? Who
Yeah,
knew that back when Survivor Space first started, we were just helping out, right?
yeah,
And now it's grown into and that's what community can do. It can grow things from a tiny little seed into a beautiful garden of a beautiful tapestry of
yeah.
friendship and support and solidarity and allyship and all the words that you can enter there that we talked about. But yeah, I guess we'll turn it over to Becky if there's any final thoughts or questions, or yeah, just we're both honored to be here. And thank you to Survivor Space and Zero Abuse Project for giving us the gift of community in a very real and tangible way. So,
Thank you both so much. And I just kept thinking, listening to your conversation, just how fortunate I am to be in my position and, to be part of Survivor Space. I mean, uh, all all along my career, for a long time, working in victim advocacy, I walked alongside a lot of survivors, but in the very distinct role of advocate survivor, right? Like I was there to support them, to, help them access whatever they needed to support their healing. And it was never like appropriate for me to share of myself or to sort of kind of cultivate this sense of community, right? Just because of the nature of that relationship. But working in survivor space, all the folks that I've had the opportunity to interact with, everything that joins us together, we're survivors, right? Like that's the common thread. But to interact with people who they're not clients, they're not someone I'm providing services to. They're like survivor leaders, they're peers, and that to me has been such an honor and so energizing to me personally that I can cultivate relationships with people. We can talk about things, our lives, we can joke about things. We can I can share more of myself, because I'm not restricted to that like advocate role. So I just want to say that you all have been a big part of being community for me, personally, professionally, and as a survivor. So I appreciate you both and everyone who has contributed to Survivor Space. Just an incredible honor, and I think your conversation just kind of highlights the power of that and different forms of community. So thank you both so much.